Welcome to Conscious Living on Co-op Radio 100.5 FM in Vancouver, Wednesday nights, 6 to 7. Also available as a podcast on www.consciouslivingradio.org, on our YouTube channels, and of course, right now, if you're watching on Facebook Live. So I'm here with Mark Caron. I'm Tasha Simms, and we're going to dive into domestication, which is kind of an interesting word. I think we'll unpack that as we, it's like being domesticated. It's so second, it seems in this world, when I look out at it, it's so second nature that it's not even being talked about. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about today, just to have this perspective and take a look at the humans' relationships to animals, which is including ourselves, of course, and our whole disconnect from nature, and how, as our guest says, may be the root trauma for much of the human experience, and something that we then perpetuate on others. So Ren Hurst is our guest, author, mentor, tracker, guide, helping people address the trauma of domestication. She supports people in navigating the wilderness of their inner lives and relationships, and restore their connection to their most authentic, emotionally mature, wild human animal nature. After 20 years of being a professional horsewoman, Ren produced a body of work called Sanctuary 13 to help people restore this connection. So we'll talk about what that entails and how returning to wildness is not just essential to ourselves, but to the global challenges that we're facing in today's world. Her latest book is called The Wisdom of Wildness, Healing the Trauma of Domestication. So welcome to the show, Ren.
Thank you so much, Tasha and Mark. Thanks for having me.
So The Wisdom of Wildness, that's your second book, but I thought we would start off just a little bit about your first book, Riding the Power of Others. Can you give us some background as to your life, what it was like as a professional horsewoman, and what called you both to leave it and write that book?
Sure. It feels like such a world away, that first book and that life. I had no idea when I was exploring what that first book was about, what it was actually leading me towards. And to be honest, had I known ahead of time, I'm not sure I would have continued down this path. But so I grew up in Texas. I had a very, tumultuous upbringing, a lot of trauma in my early childhood. Nothing like crazy out of the ordinary, but pretty extensive compared to the average person. And that drew me to horses, which it does a lot of young women in predicaments such as mine. And there was a sense of freedom and empowerment that came from being on the back of these large, powerful animals. And I became a professional trainer and went through the ranks of all the different modalities that were coming out 20 years ago, from natural horsemanship to the liberty movement to positive reinforcement to dancing with horses to energetic manipulation. Whatever was out there, you name it, I was looking for it and following all these different esoteric paths because I wanted to be the best I could be at it. And I got quite successful locally. And then I joined a school of horsemanship called Nevzorov Okol out of Russia. And in that school of horsemanship, it was a very different paradigm of relating to the horse. We saw the horses as equals. We weren't allowed to control them in any way that was conscious, that was known. There was no manipulation. But that school and that body of work does not take into consideration power dynamics or, trauma or energetics on any level. At least it didn't at the time I was a student. But what it did for me is I was applying their philosophy to an untrained stallion. And within 2 weeks, my entire paradigm and my history of success as a horse trainer became unraveled and just kind of shattered. To give you an example of what I was experiencing, we were teaching these horses educational exercises that didn't make sense as a horse trainer to how they were able to do the things we were teaching them to do. We were educating them the way you might educate a 5-year-old child in terms of how to choose colors and choose different shapes. Some of the horses were even being taught Latin, as crazy as that sounds, but there are video demonstrations on how that was done. And it left me thinking, whoa, what are we doing? I'm cultivating the intellectual capacity and the emotional capacity of this animal. And that is not what I signed up for. And at the time, I had 13 horses in my care, and I just couldn't do what I had been doing anymore. But ultimately, I had a moment with this stallion where we were working together one day, and I just had this enormous moment of realization that not only had I never been loved unconditionally, I had never loved unconditionally until that moment with him. And it broke my heart. Like it just completely shattered everything, because like all the pain that I had experienced suddenly made sense, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. All I knew is I couldn't do what I used to do, and my career and my life was over as I knew it. So I took all the money I had in the bank. I quit my career as a horse trainer and a farrier, and I put the horses on a truck out to Mount Shasta, California, and we landed in the high desert there, and I wrote the book. And it's just been an ongoing exploration of diving into the depths of what that was. And writing on the power of others really just gives you the historical like account of where I come from, and it alludes to the what. I had no idea what I was getting into when I started diving deeper into this, and navigating the layers of subtle codependency, both in my life and the collective consciousness of humanity. But when I started applying this to dogs, it all became very, very clear what I was actually looking at.
Wow. Yeah. When I started reading your book, I just kept remembering these moments I'd have when I was in my early 20s, not connecting with human beings, finding them so confusing, like so and I'm a smart person, but I couldn't understand what people were up to. Like it was so painful. And I remember being in the back of a taxi cab in Toronto. Of course, those were the days where I was also drinking, so I was seriously emotional. But crying, weeping, these heartbreaking tears, going, why can't we be like animals? Why can't we be like my goats? Because I used to have goats in Prince Edward Island. It's so simple. It's so clear. But reading your book, I'm going, you know what? It's still not that simple or clear, because, and this is what I want to get into today, because it was a moment for me with looking at my dog going, what am I doing here really? What is really going on here? So let's bring our listeners into this. You know, you walked away from your career. I want to introduce that word, domestication, and I guess how you landed in it. What was the aha that happened for you where you went, wow, there's a trauma in here, something that's going on in the idea of being domesticated is traumatic. Can you kind of touch on that?
Yeah, interestingly enough, like when I first started using that word, I was not aware of how common it has become in our language, and how many people are talking about it at a very helpful level. Everything I know about trauma, I learned from this work with animals. And so I don't know when I started using the word specifically, but I did understand how I had undomesticated the herd of horses, because as a trainer, I knew what it took to domesticate, which was to intentionally interrupt their emotional process in order to control them. So, and it
Wow.
doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, I'm
Yeah.
taking away their sovereign guidance in order to get them to do what I want them to do.
Yeah.
And, you know, we don't perceive that as a negative thing because we don't understand what it's costing us, or the fact that each of us have been treated in a similar way by parents, authority figures, government, whatever it is, for eons. I mean, I have no idea when domestication began, but if wolves were domesticated at least 14,000 years ago, it was a long time ago. So, you know, as Mark and I were speaking to, even, I mean, it wasn't white colonizers domesticating wolves. We're all involved in this. And it doesn't matter like what color our skin is or where we come from or what we've experienced. As a species, we have lost touch with the animal nature of our existence. So this domestication, or I'll define trauma first, how I'm using it. Trauma is the prolonged and unresolved interruption in emotional development, whereas domestication is the intentional, even if unconscious, interruption in emotional development in order to control behavior.
Wow. And the codependence that you touch on, do you see that as a stage of development for children, all children?
Not codependence. So children are dependent, which means that they literally depend on a guardian to model emotional maturity. But what is happening more often than not in our species is we have an emotionally immature adult having a baby. Then there's codependence and enmeshment in being like happening. And then that child then never has a chance to fully emotionally develop. And where people may argue with that is, there's quite a few people that present as emotionally mature to some degree. And I would then take my body of work, put it against their life and be like, okay, well, what if we remove all the unearned privilege that's externally regulating them? How emotionally mature are they actually?
Right.
And so then it's very complex.
So if I could just dig in there a little deeper, because my understanding's a little bit different. I mean, I agree with everything you just said, but when I say stage of development, I mean, in terms of the force, like that child needs to belong to that family to survive. Literally, that baby needs to belong. And my understanding of that process is that everything's personal to a child. So they're interpreting which parts of themselves are not acceptable for this system and cutting them off. They're already, like, in other words, it's not someone just doing it to you. It's actually what happens that we then have to heal from or move to the next stage of development, independence, being a separate self. And now what I think you're talking about, which is interdependence, where there is no manipulation, where you're 100% you, and so is everybody else. And so there's no hooking in that happens in codependence anymore. But I see those three stages as developmentally part of human evolution. Does that resonate for you, or do we just see it differently?
We see it slightly different because of the use of codependence. Codependence implies that the parent is dependent on the child in some way, and that shouldn't be happening. If we have an emotionally mature caregiver, that individual is independent and emotionally aligned and emotionally mature, the same way a wolf or a bear or anyone in the wilderness is. And their relationship to that child is unconditional in nature, in that the only reason for that relationship is to produce an emotionally mature dependent that is no longer dependent once they become emotionally mature. And so I agree with everything else, but that codependence doesn't need to happen. And I think that the reason it does is because we are a domesticated species. You don't see codependence emotionally speaking. And that's what I mean when I say codependence. Codependence is emotional dependence on one another, which most people are operating on some level at, even if they, aren't aware of it.
Right. Great. Thanks for clarifying that. In terms of the disconnect from nature being the root trauma, from your perspective of what's going on with human beings, can we include that here as well?
Yes.
The nature being, when you say nature, you mean both the child's nature and nature, like external nature?
Well, it depends on how we look at that. Like when we are emotionally mature, and what I mean when I'm saying that is that I can stay fully in my body for the full spectrum of emotion and relate to the entire spectrum equally as internal guidance. And I like to interpret it as this is how the soul speaks through the body to the individual. You can interpret it however you want, but my body, my animal, is a conduit for universal energy to inform me about my perspective of my experience. So emotion is my most important tool to navigate life. And when it is interrupted, I am very easily manipulated and controlled by the outside world. But when we are fully emotionally integrated, there is no separation between us and nature, regardless of where we live and how close we are to it, because that, restores the connection to our natural inhabitants.
Why do you think some people are so afraid of it, of
Because
what you just
people are
described?
deeply conditioned to not embrace pain as a positive thing. Ultimately, I've been teaching this work for 4 or 5 years now. The main obstacles are, for one, people have very large inner critics. When your inner critic is alive and well, your nervous system cannot relax enough to feel emotion. So they're sabotaging themselves through inner dialogue and story. But number two, very, very few people have the courage to embrace the unknown and the physical discomfort that comes from integrating with emotion that has been interrupted. It doesn't matter what emotion it is. We can label them, we can separate them. It's all energy, but there's different ranges of energy that we're comfortable with, that we're familiar with, and our trauma is the gap in the ones that we're not. So you might have trouble staying in the body for joy just as much as somebody else might have trouble staying in the body for anger. But all of those emotional experiences are actually information for us, about us, so that we learn how to navigate. And most of us are making it about someone else or something else, and something to move away from, something to move towards. And it's all, that is the difference between being an animal and being a domesticated human, and why domesticated humans feel so unsafe to be around, because it's very chaotic energy that in the wilderness just doesn't stand. In the wilderness, you get eaten for walking around with that kind of energy.
I think the toughest one for me was helplessness.
Yeah.
I entered so many fields where I had been cut off, like consciously, to feel them and go, okay, I didn't die. And it gives you sort of the courage to keep going. But helpless was so painful because it mirrored, I think, very much what we all experience as kids. We are in a way powerless. And so if you're in a toxic situation, you're literally walking back into that, as if I think the body doesn't really know whether it's happened back then or it's happening right now when you're experiencing it. So the fear is real.
Well, and the stories we create exacerbate that enormously. A lot of our emotional experience is simply the outcome of what we're telling ourselves. And the more intense and painful, the less true it is. And so when we have a really hard time staying with something, it's because we're lying to ourselves. That's our body's way of saying, hey, you're not in alignment with the reality of who you are and what you're capable of right now. You're perceiving an external threat when you could choose to just feel everything and learn how to navigate from an energetic place that isn't rooted in fear and survival.
Does all of this rest on, maybe you could describe the soul from your perspective? It seems to me it all rests on having that connection, cultivating the awareness of that connection as your power source. Am I reading you right?
Maybe. I don't really know what the soul is. I just know that I am not just this body and this story and this whatever. Like, I'm so aware that when I surrender to myself as conduit for energetic, like just movement, things happen that I can't explain with my mind. And I'm in an authentic state of power that has the capacity to create very deliberately in this existence that is not easy to access on a consistent basis, but that's because of trauma. The more we learn how to integrate and close those gaps in emotional development, the more we live in that state of, I guess you could call it grace, where you're able to really deliberately intend how a lot of things unfold and what you attract and what you don't attract. And we touch on it in different areas, like the law of attraction and things like that, but those are all not fully grounded versions or of a scientific nature of what I'm talking about. They touch on a lot of really key points, but there's so much unearned privilege involved in how people interpret those things. I trust no path to love that doesn't equally embrace fear and pain as informative devices in the same way that joy and bliss can. And so pain is a welcome teacher in my body and in my life. And it doesn't mean I go seek it out, but when it arrives, I'm like, okay, I'm paying attention. Hi.
Yeah, anything less is a spiritual bypass. I think a lot of people are like going, yes, let me feel that bliss and love. It's so fantastic. Right. Yeah, great. And it's not authentic. And I think we've all felt that too, being in relationship with a person who's attached to joy and bliss, period. Another painful experience in my story. You know what I mean? There's no real connection happening because it's a self that you have created versus the self that you are. Tell us about this new book, how you came to write it, what inspired you to go, okay, I've got another one in me. I've got to get this out.
Well, I knew that the horses weren't enough, and I knew what I had experienced wasn't enough to help people, really. I mean, when I wrote the first book, we had sanctuary that people could come and meet the horses, and everybody had mind-blowing experiences, and everybody was very touched by, meeting this herd of undomesticated animals. But it was all just bypassing. People were coming out and having a positive experience, and then, not doing the thing that made that possible. And everybody wanted to be involved, and everybody wanted to support it. And I didn't know what trauma was at that point. And so I wasn't leading with any sort of integrity or maturity around it. And when I started applying it to dogs, because I realized that what's the point if I'm just going to do this with horses? I started working with Denali, and it was like, oh shit, like this is so much harder than people are going to be up for. But it was a can of worms I couldn't close, and it was Pandora's box, and I just couldn't stop. And I've lost 2 marriages over this. I've lost a thriving career. I mean, this has cost me everything, and also given me the only thing that really matters, which is like my emotional sovereignty, autonomy, and freedom. And I don't walk through the world with a lot of fear or inability to regulate myself. And while I'm still dealing with the fallout of everything that, I walked away from, especially with 33 animals in my care and no, solid income to, take care of them. There was no way to turn away from this once I saw what it was. And if you read Writing on the Power of Others, at the end of that book, I'm really positive and it's very good. Well, in the coming couple years, I lost all of those supportive mechanisms that were externally regulating me, the supportive partner, the home, the community support, because let me tell you, when you start questioning people's love of their dogs, you piss a lot of people off.
Yeah.
And so I had to come back out to the desert and start over from scratch and realize that while I had touched on the real thing through external regulation, now it was time to learn how to get there in a sustainable internal way, which meant I had to learn how to stay in my body for the most epic of fear and pain and unknown journey.
Without any certainty. That's the part, right? The brain's just going, what?
Like, yeah, you have to be willing to die. And I wanted to. The only reason I didn't is because I had to take care of these animals. But in the moments that I learned what this really was, I was willing and ready.
And would you call your relationship with Denali an awakening for you? Was it a teacher? It was certainly a teacher. Yeah. Can you tell us more specifically how that unfolded, and let's scare our listeners with your take on people and dogs. Let's do it. Come on.
So, I mean, Denali's a husky that showed up in my life because she's a white, blue-eyed, beautiful animal, and I was an exploitive human that wanted that creature. So I took her in because she was going to get shot. She was eating everybody's chickens in the neighborhood that I was working in. And, she's a gorgeous dog. And back then I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I just saw this pretty dog and wanted to take her home. And she was just ridiculous. I mean, we would leave her in the house and come home to every cabinet in the kitchen open, the fridge opened, windows busted out. She was completely uncontrollable. And granted, I could have trained her probably, except I had just quit training horses for all the reasons outlined in Writing on the Power of Others. And I was like, there's no way I'm not going to go back and do the thing I used to do, knowing that that's not the path I'm on, but I don't know what to do different. Right. This dog is insane and she's ruining my life. And so I brought her out here to California with me and just eventually started applying the same methodology to her as I had the horses. And was it so much harder, because the horses are a captive audience. Like, you can go out to the pasture, do the little thing to make them emotionally sovereign, and then go back home. And it's actually not that difficult. Other people would probably disagree with that. But comparatively speaking, it's not that difficult. When you're living side by side with an animal and having to do this all day, every day, oh boy, it's an instant reflection of every single way you are totally screwed up. Right. And how much this is so different than the collective consciousness, and how there's not going to be any support for this because it flies in the face of everything we are taught as a society. Society wants us to be afraid. They want us to be emotionally immature because then we can be marketed to, then we can be moved, then we can be controlled. When you are emotionally mature, you are dangerous to the powers that be. And so that's why they wanted to kill this dog. And so I started working with her in the same way and realized, wow, I don't know how to feel my feelings. I'm a mess. And it was just, it was a lot.
What is the this? You use the word this when I started to do this with Denali. Tell me what specifically the this is that you were
So
doing.
you essentially remove every manner of control that isn't very specifically for the animal, the captive dependent. If it's not very specifically for their immediate care and well-being, you don't do it. So there's no manipulation, no training. You don't get to benefit anymore from having a captive dependent. In fact, you start seeing how absolutely insane it is to be an animal that desires captive dependency in another. Where would that come from? An emotionally healthy animal? Why would we want that? We want that because we're not emotionally mature. So we depend in a very codependent and meshed way on captive dependents to regulate us, even though we're the guardians and they literally depend on us to model that regulation. So it's a very backwards, screwed up relationship. And we see this between human parents and children all the time too, which is really devastating. I mean, my own mother has the emotional maturity of probably a 3-year-old, and that is not helpful to a growing, developing child.
Right.
And so people see animals in therapy as a good thing because it makes people feel better. Well, I'm not interested in making people feel better. I'm interested in teaching people how to feel so that they heal the trauma of our collective, domestication. And we suddenly then become a very, very different kind of human animal that is working much more in alignment with our natural, design, and not causing disruption and havoc on a planet that cannot handle our chaos for much longer. When you are emotionally mature, you just naturally don't behave in a way that's outside of the balance. But people don't understand that because humans are thinking instead of feeling.
And I do want to get to the global part, but I'm still fascinated with Denali.
She is still alive, by the way. She'll be
Is she?
this year.
Wow. All right. So what happened to the havoc? What happened to you? Just had to accept it? What did you do inside yourself to relate to the chaos that was being generated on a form level around you?
Well, I paid attention to her and I learned how to feel. And what I noticed when I would take her out into the wilderness to try to learn from and with her, when my chaos settled, she was more drawn to me. And she is my captive dependent. So she's not an idiot. She knows how, we have an enormous amount of influence over the captive dependents in our care. We don't have to train them. We just have to be the safest animal in the room. So as my emotions became less chaotic and more stabilized, and I was able to do that internally and on purpose, she desired to be with me more and more and more. And then the most miraculous stuff started happening. All I would have to do is simply, speak to what I wanted. I wouldn't even have to speak it. I could think it, I could intend it. And she became extremely cooperative. And it was like, well, I knew that from horses, but it was unbelievable to take this crazy husky and earn her cooperation through my own internalized regulation, because all I had to do was be a safe leader and model safe leadership. And it has been such a journey with that and all these different animals I've worked with. And it's just not complex and it's not marketable. You can't sell this. You become this. There is no way to, this is not a technique. It's not a modality. It's not a method. It's grow up and feel your feelings and become an emotionally mature animal that feels safe energetically to be around. And when you model that authenticity, it's very easy to gain cooperation wherever you are. And, there are plenty of people that take advantage of knowing some of that and use it as a power play. But the more emotionally mature you are, the less you can get away with that, because that just doesn't exist.
It doesn't fly. Yeah. And this applies to humans, right? I mean, instead of, it amazes me how much information there is out there about how to get your partner to change. And I'm going, whoa, like the whole focus is in the wrong place. Like I've known that for a long time, that being externally referenced is like a ticket to being held hostage. It's so not empowering. Whereas being internally referenced, when you land in it, you don't even have to be right about your experience, but you could say, I'm having this experience. No one can argue with you if you're not blaming them for it. You're just having it. That's just what's happening. And that kind of, to me, that's emotional maturity that I find very difficult to find in the world. But
Yeah.
I'd love it. Do you believe that everything you just shared would apply if you kept doing that kind of deep work, that it would eventually, the people drawn to you or that want to interact with you, um, perhaps the likelihood of them understanding this increases too?
You know, that understanding it is one thing, being
Being
willing to
able
do
to
it
do
really
it.
is another.
Yeah.
So I have a small international following of students, and you know, they love to come to class and they love to hear me talk, and I love them and appreciate them so much. But the amount of them that are actually actively engaged every day with this is small, because it is painful and it's
Yeah.
terrifying until
Yeah.
you learn how to surrender to something bigger than your mind. And
Yeah.
it's to be in the body with those gaps of emotional development without somebody that's emotionally mature guiding you through that
Yeah.
process, or
Yeah.
holding space for the depths of pain that you have to have a relationship to in order to hold space for this. It's rare. It's very rare amongst our species. There's not very many people that are intimate enough with their own pain and fear to hold space for another's pain and fear. And that's where a lot of therapy, especially talk therapy, fails. Makes people feel better, teaches them lots of techniques and things. We can reprogram our minds and reprogram our behaviors, but nothing teaches you how to feel until you're willing to. And
Mhm.
that's the hardest part. Well, it's the second hardest part of this. Once you learn how to stay in your body for everything, then you have to really practice changing your habits of behavior so that you're not creating emotional experiences that aren't actually there.
Right. And one more piece around Denali, which touched me when they went missing or were kidnapped or dog napped or whatever. And you said in the book, you said unconditional love. It was a realization for you that unconditional love is to be applied in relationship to everything, not just humans. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that and your awareness through, I guess, the panic initially of the dog being gone.
You know, it was quite a test to see how much faith I actually had in this, when she disappeared, and how easily it would have been to make other people wrong or to get upset or let fear guide me. And every night, what I did is I was like, okay, well, how does Sanctuary 13 apply to this situation, to this life circumstance I'm in? And I would just every night surrender and find this place of allowing, of like, I cannot control this. I can control my attention, I can control my words, I control my behavior, I control what I believe, but I cannot control these circumstances. And I would just feel it and grieve each night. And it cleared so many pathways to open up the potentiality for her being returned. And there is no doubt in my mind that that is the only thing that allowed her to come home, because the people responsible for keeping her and taking her felt safe enough to come into my space and bring her back. Um, and you think work is hard with dogs, who in intimate sexual relationships, this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like, how much am I willing to grow and learn and evolve rather than use you for some perceived need of mine?
Yeah. That's big. That's massive.
That's the
Um,
third. We're working on that right now.
all right. That's great. That's good. To me, so I am a therapist and I don't do talk therapy. I mean, we get over that as quickly as we can so we can dive into the body, because to me, it's all about that. But this piece of human relationship, and it's like rewiring yourself to feel safe inside enough and to keep going with it when you recognize that you have an expectation, that you have some belief that whatever gaps or holes you have in you are meant to be filled by another person. Letting go of that is one of the biggest obstacles or hurdles or challenges I think that I see people move through, because you have to feel all the loss.
Yeah.
The happy ending isn't coming. This is it. This is, I say,
We're
shape this.
responsible for you. No one's coming to save
Yeah,
you. You
that's
have
right.
to feel your feelings.
Yeah, this is it. But the beauty is when they realize, or we realize, that in doing that, you actually fill that gap, that hole or that space becomes filled, because the more you do it on repeat, the more empowered you are, the more plugged in you are, the more information you get. There's a kind of safety and acceptance when you realize something is unconditional. It's just not out there.
No,
Right.
and you have to have faith to take
Yeah.
those steps, because you don't get to have, this is experiential information. You only know it's true through the experience of it. You can come listen to me or whoever talk all day long, and you'll never learn what this is. It is through having the faith and the courage to step into the unknown and experience something radically different than your conditioning that you find the truth. But I'd say the biggest obstacle is understanding that this notion of right and wrong is domestication.
Right.
And there is no right and wrong in the wilderness. There's only cause and effect. And that is the biggest hurdle I have with my clients and with my students, is getting them out of this paradigm of thinking they're good or bad.
Mhm.
And it just is. And the more deeply connected you are, the less harm you cause as a natural result of that connection.
Can we go through the 13 principles without that, and you call that Sanctuary 13? First of all, how'd you come up with the name? And I'd love it if we went through them for the
I have to
listeners.
get my list, because I couldn't even tell what they are off the top of my head. Sanctuary 13, the name came from when I first moved out here from Texas, and tried to create a horse sanctuary from a whole different understanding of what we were doing. We called it Sanctuary 13 because it was based around this original herd of 13 undomesticated horses. And then as I continued to delve into the work and discover what it really was about, it became, well, I don't even know how. I just trust that number 13. The 13 is the death card. 13 is, this is the death of domestication. And so when I sat down one afternoon to determine, like, okay, what are the principles that I am, like, what is this? Like, I was naturally doing it. And I wasn't really sure how to teach it. And I knew it needed to be in a teachable format. So I just sat down and I was like, what are the obstacles to unconditional love? And I just started making a list. And these are the 13 principles that came as a result of making that list. And it just happened to be 13, and it has maintained its consistency for years now. And as far as I'm concerned, this is tried and true science. I have never been failed by this body of work. It's like when we are stuck, when we're not sure, I can go through this list of principles and find exactly where I'm out of alignment with unconditional love. These principles are parameters. They are not dogma. They are not rules. They're the guiding force that will keep you true and honest with yourself. And if you are leaving one of them out in your interactions, you're probably finding a blind spot that you easily convince yourself that you're not bypassing when you are. And the principles will practically show you why. So how deep do you want to get into them?
Well, at least let's see. Let's start and see which one twigs deeper diving.
Okay, so they each have a very surface level application, and then they have a deeper energetic component. The first principle is first, do no harm. Now that could be interpreted a lot of different ways. What it ultimately means is, for one, you have to be safe for yourself in order to be safe for another. So if you have a harmful internal dialogue, your nervous system is never going to relax enough for you to even go on to the next principle. So, but it's also removing anything from the relationship to whatever you're relating to that causes, intentional harm for the purposes of controlling. So, where horse people are concerned, you can argue with me all day long, but if you think putting a piece of metal in a horse's mouth doesn't hurt their mouth, you're not ready for this. Okay. Let's just call it what it is. It's a piece of metal meant to control the animal. And so on the very surface level, it was about looking at those kinds of things and getting them out of the equation so that we could have a more honest interpretation of what was actually going on. The second principle is control only what is yours to control. So how we interpret that is, what is yours to control is your attention, your behavior, your beliefs, and your words, and the basic needs of the dependents in your care, because the dependents are an extension of you to some degree until they are no longer dependents. And where animals are concerned, they're permanent and they're captive. So, but what is yours to control is their basic needs, safety, and well-being, not who they are, not what they feel, not their emotions. So with controlling what is yours to control, it is the complete removal of systems of reward and punishment, all removal of manipulation, all removal of trying to manipulate, coerce, control behavior in order to make your life easier instead of you stepping into a more authentic leadership role. So when you have not built the relationship that Sanctuary 13 leads to, we replace training with what I call neutral physical boundaries. And so that could be a leash, that could be a kennel, that could be a yard, but we don't use those things to control the animal's experience. We just control their physical limitations. So like walking a dog on a leash under the guidance of Sanctuary 13 looks like never using the leash to pull, to indicate, to whatever. It's just there as a neutral physical boundary so that you can work on your energetic alignment to earn the relationship outside of those things. Or with a horse, it might be, and that's not to say there's no right and wrong in this. So it's like in emergency situations, in times where you're not practicing, you do what you have to do in the moment. You just hold yourself accountable for, that probably set us back a few stages because I relied on this instead of learning how to regulate myself. Yep. Like in the context of my situation out here, we have very few resources to be maintaining this many animals. And so, back when I had more resources, I could trim every horse here without any halters, with just using the relationship. But the thing about relationship, Tasha, is you have to show up for it. If you're overextended, you lose it. And then the animal trusts you even less because they're like, where have you been? And so this is hard, and there's no middle ground. You either go all in or you rely on, the fact that you have to control the animals in your care. If you try to half-ass this in some way, you get very unhappy animals that know how to speak up for themselves and are even more difficult to control. Third principle is expect nothing, understanding that a dependent in your care owes you nothing for the dependency you place them in. And to expect something of them in a results-oriented way it doesn't work with the nature of that relationship. That is a power dynamic that leads to dysfunction if you have expectations of the one who literally depends on you for their care and survival. And yet that is often the opposite of what we do when we place someone in our dependency. So expect nothing, that's on the surface, but on the internal, it's understanding what energetic attachment feels like and how to release it. Because when you release attachment to anything, outcomes, whatever it may be, you open up the channels for cooperation. So an animal will often say no just to the energy of expectation and say yes to feeling free to say no. So that's where that principle comes
which again includes humans, because that's what people do. They don't want to be controlled in the deepest way, right?
Yeah, and humans are animals. So really this is universal. And, once you master it with animals, that becomes pretty boring. And then you're like, oh, wow, this is actually about us, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like once my horses have all, moved on and died, I'll be over that section of my life. Like this is so much bigger than animals that are outside of our animal. So I'm going to just go through quickly here because the book will explain all of these in detail.
Yeah.
Love is not a transaction. Understanding that leveraging a basic need such as food for behavior is a really dysfunctional way of relating to a dependent. You should never withhold something that they depend on you for to control their behavior. If you do, such as positive reinforcement, you get an animal that operates very differently, no matter how compliantly and cooperatively, than an animal who is sovereign enough to have a conversation with you. I think that's a whole nother can of worms for another day. But so the fifth principle is speak only with reverence. This is about eliminating baby talk and understanding where baby talk comes from and how energetically influenceable the animals in our care and the children in our care are just through our tone in our energetics, and how a dog that's super excited to see you when you get home is a dysregulated dog. There's a reason that 1 in 2 dogs dies of cancer and that over 75% of them have anxiety disorders. We like to feel loved. So we love it when our animals feel happy to see us. But what I want to see when I get home is calm, regulated animals that maybe gently wag their tails and are like, hey, mom, good to see you. Okay, I'm going to go back over here and do my thing. So that's a big part of that. But Speak Only with Reverence is also eliminating a lot of the storytelling we tell through animals, a lot of the interpretation of them we give instead of just getting to know them each day as if it's a brand new day. Because of our influence over them in that power dynamic, we can so easily change the nature of how they present themselves just through our interpretation of who they are. So I try to leave a lot of room for them to show me who they are on a daily basis rather than me decide that for them. Sixth principle is always create a space of invitation that is mostly about physical touch and understanding that I should not be, crossing any lines of bodily autonomy, especially for my own purposes. So this is where people really get excited about this. You mean I can't pet my dog? I mean, you can, but bodily autonomy is a big thing. And when we pet a dependent for our own benefit, nobody really benefits long-term or in any sort of sustainable human evolutionary kind of way. We just get a momentary, experience of regulation. We don't evolve as a species.
The dog can initiate though?
They can, but this is all super complex. So we could go quickly through these principles, but there is no ending to the layers in this.
Okay.
If they can initiate, but there should also be a space of invitation from the animal if it's coming from a healthy space. Otherwise, if they're imposing on you or you're imposing on them, this is a dysfunctional relationship. And so it's about really slowing down enough to have the conversation of, do you want to be touched? And also checking in with myself with, why am I touching you? Am I touching you to be of benefit to you as a dependent? Or am I touching you because I've had a bad day at work and I want to feel better? And now I'm going to use you as my dependent to regulate myself. And then, both of our lives are screwed because I haven't learned how to feel my feelings. And, I joke, but nobody's mastered this. I certainly haven't. I'm a practitioner of my work. And when I teach my classes on this, I show up as raw and unfiltered as anyone else, because this is hard. And when you create that space of invitation with these animals, you start to see how often they actually say no in the most subtle way that you would have never known had you never slowed down enough to always create that space. They don't want to regulate you unless that is the only way they get to feel better. So often animals come to us for affection just to make the room feel better, not because they like us. Because when they depend on you for emotional stabilization in whatever home they're in, of course they're going to come regulate you because they need you regulated in order for them to feel safe. And most people interpret that as, oh, my cat loves me, or oh, my dog loves me, when really they just want you to chill out. So it is what it is. So very quickly, honor every no, which means looking for the no, not trying to look for a yes, not trying to turn a no into a yes, not trying to change the animal's interpretation. There is so much information available in looking for the no, whether that be the animal or the person you're dating. Man, all the things I could have saved myself from if I had been looking for the no in my relationships instead of the yes. Your boundaries are your responsibility, meaning you are the one responsible for the boundaries you need to have, and you are the one responsible for making sure that your needs are met in those boundaries, not expecting someone else to respect your boundaries, or even naming them, or even telling people what they are. All of that can be useful, but at the end of the day, we have to be responsible for our own boundaries. And so an example of this with animals, like in the horsemanship world, oh my gosh, like people think respect and boundaries is whacking a horse with a stick to get them out of your space, when it's really about move your ass out of the way so that you don't get hurt or stepped on, and understand that it is much more complex than people want to make that. When I disengage my energy from an animal, they listen and they respect that. But if I'm thinking about that animal while moving away, I'm literally bringing them with me.
Right.
So if you want to see how powerful this is in a very experiential way, in a super simple way, the next time a dog or a cat is climbing on you or putting paws on you in a way that isn't invited, that you don't want, bring your full awareness into your navel area, and within 10 seconds, that animal will disengage unless they're trained to attack you. But it is it is amazing how powerful this energy stuff is if we will just be in our bodies instead of our minds. Because if we're thinking about the animal, it can be negatively or positively, we are drawing them in because that's the language they speak. Number 9, everyone is always right. Everybody loves this one. That means that everyone is behaving in a way that is 100% in accordance with their reality. And going against that is just an avenue for conflict. And when you're willing to be responsible for yourself and be responsible for your own needs and boundaries, what other people do and say and think really isn't that interesting anymore. That is an unconscious attempt to feel safe when we try to control or judge other people. Non-judgment comes from emotional maturity, not mindfulness. When I can feel everything in my body and I'm willing to be responsible for my own needs, judgment doesn't exist. Judgment is the external projection of a need I'm unwilling to meet in myself because I'm probably unconscious of it. So go ahead.
We've got 5 minutes left. So I want to make sure that we also talk about where they can find out more and all that. I'm happy to put a pin in it and steer them towards your book for more.
Okay.
Because this really gave people a taste of how very practical, like everything you were talking about, and we could have kept, each one could have been a show. Like, each
one could have been a book.
A book. But they're practical. They're actually things that you would do, not just think about and go, well, that's really cool. Like they're actually,
they're true, because people like to argue with this concept, but when you put it up against the practical application, it's impossible. I would not have thrown my life away and sacrificed everything I did over a concept.
Exactly.
When you practice these principles, there is no way not to see what I'm talking about.
Okay, so I'm going to say to our listeners, go get the book to find out the rest of them. The Wisdom of Wildness, Healing the Trauma of Domestication. What have we missed that you want our listeners to know about? Maybe also tell them where to find out. We'll have links on our page, but feel free right now if you have any events or anything you want to talk about, that any offerings for the listeners.
Sure. So if anybody's resonating with any of this and wants to learn more, I started a nonprofit this past year called Wild Wisdom Incorporated. And the main purpose of the nonprofit, well, our mission is to address the trauma of domestication, but the main purpose is to act as the vehicle for Sanctuary 13. So I teach one of the principles every week online through our Patreon platform. And, it's as little as $3 a month to hop on there and learn and get really practical help in a community of people also practicing this. And that's at patreon.com/wildwisdominc. And that is the best way to access Sanctuary 13 outside of the new book. For anything else, I'm really trying to get clear on what my new offerings are going to be as an individual coming back into the world, the domesticated world. But the best place to find me is on Instagram. It's just Instagram/rendermewild. And I'll have a new website up soon at rendermewild.com. And I do offer one-on-one coaching and mentoring. But for the most part, the best way to learn this material is through the nonprofit.
Awesome. That's awesome. A great invitation. Okay. Your final wish from your heart to the world. What is it?
It is that unconditional love is unconditional, especially towards yourself. And so when you are engaging in something new and different and confronting, understand that you are a result of your trauma, but your trauma is not who you are. And all of these things that are probably triggering and really scary to consider, I invite people to really lean in and consider just giving it a try for the benefit of what it has to offer you as a sovereign wild human animal, and try to step out of this right and wrong thinking of, some false sense of safety, because the only safety we're ever going to have is the ability to feel everything.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Love talking with you.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Ren Hurst about her new book. And of course, you can catch all this on our page, www.consciouslivingradio.org. There'll be lots of links and ways to move towards connecting